and welcome back to How Language Works. I'm your friendly neighborhood linguist, Emily. In our last video, we dove into the structure of sentences by breaking down syntax, which we learned is basically the word order rules that give our sentences their structure. In this video, our journey into how language works is taking us away from sentences as we zoom into the individual words that they're made of. That's right. Today's video is all about the anatomy of a word. Maybe you've been wondering how new words get formed, or you just want to know what makes a word a word. Regardless of what curiosities led you here today, let me tell you, you are in luck, because in today's video, we're breaking down what's in a word by talking about morphology. We're talking about what morphology is, the different kinds of morphemes that exist, and why the ing in king isn't exactly the same as the ing in traveling. So without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, first things first. What is morphology? In the simplest of terms, morphology is what gives our words their internal structure. Think about it like this. Words aren't made up of random pieces of word bits cobbled together in some haphazard way. No, there's a whole structure underlying them. I like to think of morphology as the word version of a foreman on a construction site. A foreman's job, of course, is to make sure that the right pieces get combined in the right way in order to build a desired object. Same thing for morphology, except that instead of building skyscrapers, we're building words. Okay, so morphology is the system that gives our words their internal structure. So what's the system made of? Morphemes! If you said morphemes, you would be right. Morphemes are the smallest meaningful pieces of a word. So continuing with our construction analogy, instead of pieces like wooden planks, steel beams, and individual bricks, you end up with word pieces like pre, mid, ology. In short, morphemes are like the atoms of a word. Let's look at an example. Take the word traveling. How many morphemes or meaningful pieces would you say this word has? The correct answer? 2. If you said more than 2, you were probably counting how many distinct speech sounds you heard, which is a question of phonetics and not morphology. And if you want to learn more about speech sounds and phonetics, then check out our video on it, linked in the description for you. Okay, so the word traveling has 2 morphemes. What are they? The first is travel, and the second is ing. How do we know those are the 2 morphemes? Well, they're meaningful units, and we can't break them down any smaller. For example, travel is, of course, a verb, and I can't break it down into any more meaningful pieces than that. Trav, tra, sure. And ing is a grammatical unit that tells us the status of the verb. In this case, it tells us that travel is in progress. We're traveling. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. Morphology is the system that gives our words their internal structure, and morphemes are the actual pieces that make up our words. Those are the basics. Now, if you want to know just a little bit more, I'm going to share with you 6 things that you should know about morphology. Let's do it. Number 1, not all words have multiple morphemes. The word season, for example, is just one long morpheme. Same with the word umbrella or pickle. Of course, we could easily transform them into multi-morpheme words by simply tacking on other morphemes, like seasoning, umbrellas, or pickled. Okay, point number 2. Some morphemes can stand alone, others can't. Morphemes like travel and season can be their own independent words. Other morphemes like ing and ology can't. You'll notice that they only appear when attached to another morpheme, that is, to a root. Linguists call these independent morphemes free morphemes, and the dependent ones bound morphemes. Okay, number 3, order matters. When a word has multiple morphemes, that's when morphological ordering rules come into play. Take the English word redoing, for example. It has 3 morphemes. With do as the main root morpheme, we know that the re goes at the beginning and the ing at the end. This is because according to English morphology rules, re is what we call a prefix. That means goes before the root. And ing is a suffix. That means it goes after the root. Beyond prefixes and suffixes, there's one more location-based morpheme type you should know. It's called infixes. These are morphemes that go inside another root morpheme. English doesn't have many of these, but other languages do. Arabic, for example, is famous for them. Point number 4, not everything that looks like a morpheme is actually a morpheme. Here's a great example. The ing of traveling is a morpheme, but the ing of king is not. They're exactly the same sequence of sounds and letters. So what makes them different morphologically? Well, it all comes down to meaning. If the ing carries an identifiable meaning in the word, then it's a morpheme. Otherwise, it's not. Since we can't trace a specific meaning to the ing in king, we know that it's not its own distinct morpheme in this context. Point number 5, morphology is often at the heart of how new words get created. When new technologies are invented or cultural discourse shifts, we often find ourselves in need of a new word to help us talk about those topics effectively. And what do we usually rely on to do it? Morphemes. Take, for example, the word computer. Where did that word come from? Well, it came from the morpheme compute and the suffix morpheme -er to indicate the doing of the computing. Two pre-existing morphemes combined to make one useful new word. Our last point is number 6. Languages vary in how complex their morphology is. This one should come as no surprise, as different languages do language differently. This comes down to what we call the syntax morphology trade-off. This is the idea that the simpler a language's syntax is, the more complex its morphology tends to be, and vice versa. A language like English has a simple morphology, but relatively complex syntax. To learn English, you don't need to memorize a bunch of morphological conjugations or case distinctions, but you do need to master some pretty nuanced syntactic rules. In other words, languages vary in how complex their morphology is. And the main reason for this is because of the syntax morphology trade-off. Well, there you have it. We covered a lot in today's video, so let's do a final recap. So, morphology is the name for the system that gives our words their internal structure. And morphemes are what we call the smallest meaningful pieces of a word. Now, some words might have just one morpheme. Others can be made up of multiple. And when a word has multiple morphemes, there's usually a rule for how we order them. And that might depend on which morphemes are free versus bound. Additionally, not everything that looks like a morpheme is actually a morpheme. Remember, the ing in king is not morphologically the same as the ing in traveling. And don't forget about new words, because when new words like computer get created in a language, pre-existing morphemes are usually to thank. And finally, we learned that languages vary in the extent to which they rely on morphology to make meaning. The reason? The syntax morphology trade-off. If you're new here and you'd like to make sure you're up to date on all of our awesome language content, come join the Mango family by subscribing to the channel. And if you like quizzes, have I got some fun for you? Because we have created a fun and free interactive quiz for you about morphology, which we've linked for you in the description down below. It's pretty fun. So take it, see how high you score. I believe in you. Oh, and don't miss our next video in this series, where we're breaking down how we make meaning in our language through diving into the world of semantics and pragmatics. What's the relationship between words and their meaning? What meaning lies between our words? How do politeness rules influence how we ask for favors? Answers to all of that and more next time on How Language Works. Bye.